May 7th, 1945, Wright Field, Ohio. The war in Europe had been over for less than 24 hours when Captain Robert Hayes heard the voice for the first time. He stood alone in Hangar 4, surrounded by the skeletal remains of German engineering, captured Messerschmitt Me-262s with their Jumo 004B turbojets still reeking of kerosene, half-assembled Horten H-229 flying wings that looked more like fever dreams than aircraft. Operation Lusty had brought them here, these technological ghosts pulled from the collapsing Reich. The afternoon light filtered through dust and machine oil, casting long shadows across concrete floors stained with hydraulic fluid and history. Hayes was a signals intelligence officer, not a pilot. His war had been fought in cramped radio rooms, hunting enemy transmissions through walls of static. Today, he'd been assigned something different, something they wouldn't explain over the phone. They'd only told him to bring his portable RCA AR-88 receiver and report to the hangar alone. The captured Me-262 sat in the center of the space like a predator at rest. Its nose cone had been removed, exposing a tangle of wiring that shouldn't exist. The cables ran back through the fuselage in patterns that seemed almost organic, connecting to a radio unit mounted where ammunition boxes should have been. The equipment was German, Telefunken, Lorenz, but the configuration was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Hayes set up his receiver on a metal workbench, the tubes inside beginning their familiar warm-up glow. His hands moved through practiced motions, connecting leads, adjusting frequencies. The speaker crackled to life with atmospheric noise, distant stations, the electronic graveyard of a continent that had just stopped screaming. He began his sweep, turning the dial in slow increments, logging each frequency as empty or irrelevant. Then, at 42.7 megahertz, he heard it. Not static, not Morse code, a voice, human, but processed through something that stripped away its humanity. The words came in rhythmic pulses, distorted as if transmitted through water or spoken from inside a metal drum. The accent was German, but the cadence was wrong, too precise, too measured, like someone reading coordinates, but the numbers didn't follow any system he knew. Hayes felt his chest tighten. He checked his watch. 13:47 hours. The voice continued, and beneath it he detected another layer, a low-frequency hum that resonated in his sternum, a vibration that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to something older in his brain. The voice shifted. It was speaking English now. Technical terminology from aviation briefings, airspeed in meters per second, altitude in pressure readings, engine temperature in Celsius. Someone was reading flight data, but from where? Every Luftwaffe base in Germany had gone silent. Every known transmitter had been located, captured, or destroyed. The hangar felt colder. Hayes glanced at the Me-262, its empty cockpit a dark hollow in the fading light. The radio unit inside was unpowered, disconnected. He'd verified that himself. Yet the transmission continued, and now he noticed something that made his mouth dry. The voice was describing flight characteristics that matched the Me-262 exactly. Turn radius, stall speed, engine spool-up time for the Jumo 004B turbojets. Someone was flying, right now, somewhere. Hayes grabbed a pencil and began transcribing, his handwriting deteriorating into frantic scratches as the voice accelerated. The technical data gave way to coordinates, latitude and longitude using the Gauss-Kruger system. The numbers placed the transmission somewhere over central Germany, but that was impossible. Allied air patrols would have spotted any aircraft. The airspace had been locked down, cataloged, controlled. The voice stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was absolute. No static, no carrier wave, nothing. Just a hole in the electromagnetic spectrum where sound should have been. Hayes held his breath, waiting. His hand hovered over the tuning dial, afraid to move. Then it came back, but this time the voice wasn't reading data. It was whispering, a single phrase, repeated 3 times in that same processed, inhuman cadence. Sie hören uns nicht. Sie hören uns nicht. Sie hören uns nicht. The transmission cut out. Hayes sat motionless, staring at the speaker grill. His mind raced through rational explanations, a delayed broadcast, a looped recording, atmospheric skip. But none of it fit. The voice was live. He'd felt it. And those coordinates, those numbers scratched in his log. Behind him, metal creaked. Hayes spun around, his heart hammering. The Me-262 sat unchanged in the gathering darkness. But something was different. The cockpit canopy, previously open, was now closed. He was certain, absolutely certain, it had been open when he'd arrived. His eyes moved to the radio unit mounted in the fuselage. In the dim light, he could just make out a faint glow from inside the wiring bundle. Not the harsh white of electrical current, but something softer, almost organic, a phosphorescent blue that pulsed in rhythm with his own racing heartbeat. Hayes took one step toward the aircraft, then another. His hand reached for the fuselage, fingers trembling. He needed to see inside that radio unit. He needed to understand what he'd heard, what was still transmitting from somewhere that shouldn't exist. His fingertips brushed the cold metal skin of the jet. The radio behind him erupted with sound, a screaming wall of interference that drove him to his knees, hands clamped over his ears. Through the pain, beneath the static, he heard them. Not one voice now. Dozens, hundreds, all speaking at once in that same processed rhythm, all broadcasting from that ghost frequency, all reporting flight data from aircraft that shouldn't be flying. And beneath it all, almost too low to perceive, a single question repeated over and over in accented English. "Can you hear us now?" The lights in Hangar 4 went out. In the darkness, the blue glow from the Me-262's radio unit grew brighter.
May 8, 1945, Freeman Field, Indiana. Hayes arrived at Freeman Field 36 hours after the incident at Wright Field, his hands still shaking from something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite exhaustion. The official transfer papers listed him as reassigned for specialized consultation on captured enemy communications equipment. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He'd been quarantined. Someone had decided that whatever he'd heard in that hangar couldn't be allowed to spread. The base commander, Colonel Marcus Thorne, met him on the tarmac without pleasantries or questions about his well-being. Thorne was OSS, not regular Army Air Forces, and his eyes carried the particular deadness of a man who'd seen too many things that had no proper names. He led Hayes directly to a Quonset hut at the edge of the field, isolated from the other structures by 100 yards of empty grass and a perimeter of MPs who watched them approach with expressions that mixed curiosity and something close to dread. Inside, the air smelled of solder and ozone. 3 RCA AR-88 receivers sat on makeshift tables, their dials glowing amber in the dim interior. 2 Signal Corps technicians worked in silence, headphones clamped over their ears, faces pale and drawn. Between them sat another piece of equipment Hayes recognized with a jolt of nausea, a radio unit identical to the one he'd seen in the Me-262 at Wright Field. This one had been partially disassembled, its German vacuum tubes exposed like the organs of something that had died badly. Thorne closed the door behind them. The sound of it latching felt permanent. "You're not the first," Thorne said. His voice was flat, clinical. 3 days ago, attack at Farnborough in England reported similar transmissions while examining a captured Me-163 Comet. Yesterday, another at Cherbourg heard the same thing from a salvaged Arado AR-234. Always the same frequency. Always German aircraft with modified radio equipment. Always after dark. Hayes felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. How many transmissions? 17 documented incidents across 4 countries in the last 72 hours. Thorne pulled a map from his coat and spread it across a clear section of the table. Red circles marked locations across Europe, scattered seemingly at random, but Hayes's trained eye caught the pattern immediately. They formed a curve, a geographical arc that swept from Norway through Germany and into Austria. "The coordinates," Hayes whispered. "The ones I transcribed from the transmission. Did anyone plot them?" Thorne's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. He produced Hayes's original notes, now photocopied and annotated with additional markings in red ink. He placed a transparent overlay on the map, and Hayes felt his stomach drop. The coordinates formed a grid, perfect, precise, mathematical. Each point corresponded exactly to a Luftwaffe airfield or testing facility that had been operational in the final months of the war. But there was something else, additional coordinates that didn't match any known location, points in empty countryside, in forests, in mountain valleys where no airfields had ever existed. "We sent reconnaissance flights to 3 of these unknown coordinates. 2 found nothing. The third..." He paused, choosing his words with visible care. "The third found a clearing in the Bavarian Alps, scorched earth in a perfect circle 40 meters across. The vegetation showed burn patterns consistent with jet exhaust, but the damage was fresh, less than a week old." One of the technicians removed his headphones and turned toward them. His face was gray, slick with sweat. "Sir, it's starting again." His voice cracked slightly. "Same frequency, but this time there's more than one." Hayes moved to the receiver before Thorne could stop him. He placed the headphones over his ears and immediately heard the familiar processed cadence, but the technician was right. There were multiple voices now, overlapping in a strange harmony that should have been cacophonic, but instead felt almost orchestrated. They were speaking in German, rapid-fire technical jargon mixed with what sounded like navigation call-outs. Then one voice separated from the others, rising above the chorus with crystalline clarity. It spoke in English, and Hayes recognized the same accent he'd heard at Wright Field. "Achtung! Receiving station Wright Field. Receiving station Freeman Field. We know you are listening. We know you have found the equipment. This is not a recording. This is not atmospheric interference. We are here. We have always been here." Hayes's breath caught. The voice continued without pause, without emotion, reciting information that made his blood run cold. "Captain Robert Hayes, service number 07954432, Signals Intelligence Specialist, assigned Operation Lusty Technical Evaluation. You heard us first. You opened the channel. Now you cannot close it." Thorne grabbed Hayes's shoulder, but Hayes couldn't move. The voice was speaking his personal history, his training stations, his previous assignments, details that weren't in any captured German intelligence files because they'd been classified at levels the Nazis never penetrated. The other voices in the background were getting louder, their technical chatter resolving into something Hayes recognized with growing horror. They were coordinating flight vectors, approach speeds, radio calls between aircraft in formation, just like Allied bomber crews used over Germany. But these weren't bombers. The performance specifications they were discussing matched only one type of aircraft: jets. Me-262s, Me-163s, Arado AR-234s, the entire captured Luftwaffe jet fleet or something that mimicked it perfectly. Where are they transmitting from? Hayes pulled the headphones off, his ears ringing. What are they flying? Thorne's face had gone ashen. That's the problem, Captain. We don't know. Radar shows nothing. Visual observation shows nothing. But the transmissions are getting stronger, more frequent, and they're converging. Converging where? Before Thorne could answer, all three receivers erupted simultaneously with a piercing tone that drove everyone in the hut to their knees. Through the pain, Hayes heard the voice again, no longer processed or distorted, but clear as a telephone call, speaking words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sie haben die Tür geöffnet. You have opened the door. Jetzt kommen wir durch. Now we are coming through. The transmission cut to static. Then silence. Then, in the distance, growing closer with impossible speed, Hayes heard something that shouldn't exist. The distinctive howl of Jumo 004B turbojets, spooling up to full power, approaching from the west, where the evening sky was turning the color of bruises. Thorne was already moving toward the door, shouting orders to the MPs outside. But Hayes remained frozen, staring at the dismantled German radio unit on the table. The vacuum tubes were glowing now, bright blue, the same phosphorescent light he'd seen at Wright Field. And on every receiver, the frequency counter had locked on 42.7 megahertz, the needles pegged hard right, trembling with the force of something massive trying to push through from the other side of the signal.
May 9th, 1945, 03:47 hours, Freeman Field, Indiana. The sky above Freeman Field had been empty for 3 hours, but the sound never stopped. Hayes sat in the darkened Quonset hut, surrounded by equipment that had ceased to function in any rational way. The 3 RCA receivers had burned out simultaneously the previous evening, their tubes shattering in cascades of sparks that left scorch marks across the tables. The dismantled German radio unit remained active, its blue glow intensifying with each passing hour, pulsing like something breathing or waiting. Thorne had evacuated the base. MPs, maintenance crews, even the pilots, all sent to auxiliary fields 30 miles out. Only Hayes remained, along with Thorne and a single Signal Corps officer named Lieutenant Sarah Chen. She'd been brought in from Washington, someone with expertise in experimental frequency analysis that existed only in classified Pentagon files. Her presence meant this had escalated beyond military curiosity into something else entirely. Chen worked in silence. Her instruments spread across the floor in patterns that looked more like ritual than science. She was measuring things Hayes had no names for: harmonic resonance, electromagnetic coherence, terms she used without explanation. Her hands moved with steady precision, but her eyes betrayed the same barely controlled terror Hayes felt gnawing at his own chest. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness, the sound continued. Jet engines that weren't there. The howl of Jumo turbojets, the shriek of Walter rocket motors, the thunder of aircraft that radar couldn't see and human eyes couldn't track. The MPs who'd been stationed on the perimeter before evacuation had reported searchlight beams catching nothing but empty air that screamed with the acoustic signature of metal moving at speeds that pushed the boundaries of what German engineering had achieved. "It's not a transmission," Chen said suddenly. Her voice was hoarse from 3 hours of silence. "That's what we got wrong from the beginning. It was never about radio waves traveling through space." Hayes looked up from the frequency logs he'd been reviewing, page after page of data that formed patterns he almost understood. "Then what is it?" Chen gestured to the German radio unit, its glow now bright enough to read by. "It's a receiver, but not for electromagnetic radiation. The Germans were experimenting with something else in the final months: quantum entanglement communication.
Instantaneous transmission regardless of distance, using paired particles instead of radio waves. The OSS recovered documents from a facility near Prague, experimental notes from scientists who'd been working on it since 1943. Thorne stepped forward from the shadows where he'd been standing. Quantum physics is theoretical, unproven. Was theoretical, Chen corrected. Whatever these radio units are, they're not receiving signals from across space. They're receiving them from across time. The frequencies we're hearing, they're echoes, transmissions that were made in the past but exist in a state of quantum superposition, neither fully sent nor fully received until we observed them, until Captain Hayes turned on his receiver and collapsed the wave function. Hayes felt ice water flooding his veins. You're saying I caused it. I made it real. You made it observable, Chen said. There's a difference. The transmissions were always there, existing in probability states. The German scientists must have been testing the equipment, sending data forward in time to see if it could be received. They didn't understand what they'd created, a communication system that exists outside causality. Every time we listen, we strengthen the signal. We make it more real. The blue glow from the radio unit suddenly intensified, casting harsh shadows across the hut's interior. All three of them felt it, a pressure in the air like the moments before lightning strikes. The sound of jet engines outside grew deafening, no longer distant, but directly overhead, so close Hayes could hear individual turbine blades spinning. Chen's instruments went wild, needles slamming against their stops. It's peaking. Whatever's been building for the last 72 hours, it's reaching critical threshold. Hayes moved to the window, pressed his face against the glass. The pre-dawn sky was empty, utterly empty, but the sound was everywhere, surrounding them, vibrating through the bones of the earth itself. And then he saw it, not with his eyes, but with something else, a shimmering in the darkness, a distortion in the fabric of night itself, like heat haze in winter. The voice came through the German radio unit, clear and unpolluted by static, speaking in English with that same processed precision. Captain Hayes, you wanted to understand. Now you will see. We are the test pilots who never landed, the scientists who never stopped transmitting. We exist in the moment between transmission and reception, forever broadcasting our final flights. You heard us, you observed us, you made us real enough to speak, but we cannot fully return. The quantum state will not resolve completely. We are caught between what was and what might have been. Hayes felt tears streaming down his face without knowing why. What do you want from us? Nothing. Everything. We want to land. We have been landing for months, for years, forever and never. Each time you listen, we come closer to resolution. But we can never fully arrive. We are Schrodinger's pilots, simultaneously alive and dead, flying and crashed, speaking and silent. The war never ended for us. It simply became superposition. Chen was frantically disconnecting equipment, her hands shaking. We have to stop observing. If we stop listening, the wave function might collapse back to a stable state. But Thorne shook his head slowly, his face illuminated by the radio unit's terrible glow. It's too late for that. We've been listening for 3 days across multiple sites. The observation is already made. The state is already locked. The sound of jet engines reached a crescendo that shattered every window in the Quonset hut. Glass rained inward like ice crystals, catching the blue light in 10,000 reflections. Hayes fell to his knees, hands over his ears, screaming without sound. Through the broken windows, he saw them finally. Shadows against the lightning sky. Aircraft that were and weren't there. Me-262s flying in perfect formation through clouds that didn't disturb around their passage. Pilots in cockpits that existed only as probability ghosts, their faces blurred by quantum uncertainty. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The sound, the light, the pressure. The German radio unit went dark, its tubes cooling to black. Outside, the sky was empty again, normal. Dawn broke across Freeman Field in ordinary orange and gold. Hayes stood on shaking legs, crunching beneath his boots. On the table where the radio unit sat, a single piece of paper had appeared, German military stationery, dated April 30th, 1945. The handwriting was precise, technical. A flight log from a test pilot at Recklinck-Lars Airfield, documenting the final flight of Me-262 prototype V083. The last entry read simply, Frequenz 42.7. Sendeversuch erfolgreich. Wir hören uns selbst aus der Zukunft. Frequency 42.7. Transmission attempt successful. We hear ourselves from the future. Chen translated it aloud, her voice barely a whisper. They heard us hearing them. They heard our receivers picking up their signals. They were listening to us listening to them. It was always a loop. Thorne picked up the log sheet with hands that had finally started trembling. So what do we do with this? Hayes looked at the dead radio unit, then at the empty sky. Somewhere out there, in frequencies they'd never fully understand, pilots were still flying missions that would never end, transmitting reports that would never be fully received, caught in the quantum amber of observation itself. We classify it. We bury it so deep nobody will ever find it. And we never, ever tune to 42.7 megahertz again. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Someone would always be curious. Someone would always listen. And when they did, the voices would be there, waiting in the space between transmission and reception, forever flying, forever falling, forever caught